Good evening, and welcome to the Cooper Union. Welcome in particular to a discussion of one of the most significant issues in history, genocide and the Jews, a never-ending problem. It's not just an historic issue, it's also a contemporary one, as some continue to deny history. My name is Jamshed Barucha, President of the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. Few events epitomize the purpose of this great hall at Cooper Union as this one does. Cooper Union's founder, Peter Cooper, built this hall for, quote, lectures and debates most appropriate to remove the physical and moral evils that afflict our city, our country, and humanity. From the memorial service for the abolitionist John Brown to Congressman Abraham Lincoln's Right Makes Might speech that launched him to the presidency, to the founding of the NAACP, the launching of the suffragette movement, the launching of the Red Cross, and the first conference of Native American chiefs as their people were being slaughtered on the plains, all occurred in this great hall. So it is most fitting that today we have another giant for freedom, Elie Wiesel, joined by Ambassador Power and Professor Feldman. We're grateful to this evening's moderator, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, founder of the Values Network. Rabbi Shmuley served as Rabbi of Oxford University for 11 years, where he founded L'Chaim, the society to host world leaders discussing values-based leadership, a mission that parallels our own here in the Great Hall. He has been called the most famous rabbi in America by the Washington Post and Newsweek, and the best-known Orthodox Jew in the world by the New York Observer. The Guardian called him a leading American thinker. His 30 books have been bestsellers and have been translated into 20 languages. His columns appear regularly in the Wall Street Journal, the Jerusalem Post, and other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rabbi Shmuley Boteach.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, oh, that's loud. My God, we have battled with the elements the entire day. What can be said of an evening where one of our panelists is currently stuck in an airport, but we do expect the arrival of Professor Noah Feldman, who's coming from Cambridge? What can be said of a banner that was also stuck in the rain, but look, it's moving miraculously by itself? Oh, right, okay, I feel like I'm on The Price is Right. Behind door number 3, I wonder if there's a car for everyone in the audience. Okay, at least Mort Klein of the ZOA appreciates that. But the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, with all of the hurdles that we faced to put this evening on, because we had 2 weeks' notice when we finally were able to meld the schedules of Professor Elie Wiesel with that of Ambassador Samantha Power, I want you to know that any room in which Elie Wiesel is to be found is a special evening that will be unforgettable. You will tell your children, and your grandchildren about this evening, together with Professor Wiesel, who will live to a robust and healthy 120 at the very least, Rabbi Eliezer. You will tell them that you sat in the same room as the greatest living Jewish personality on planet Earth. You will tell them that you were in the same room as one of the three most respected human beings alive. On any list, the only people who would be in the pantheon of Elie Wiesel, the world's leading humanitarian, would be the Dalai Lama, with whom I had the great honor of sharing a platform just 10 days ago in Alabama, and with Pope Francis. But no one else would be in that pantheon because no one else has devoted their lives towards establishing the infinite worth of every individual and the unqualified dignity of the human person. My friends, with us tonight is the face of the Holocaust, the very living embodiment of the martyred 6 million, a true legend in his own lifetime, the pride and radiance of the Jewish people, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace, and the voice that dared thunder and challenge the heavens itself in the face of the world's greatest crime, the one and the only Elie Wiesel. And the truth is that tonight is as much a tribute to Professor Wiesel, who just celebrated, thank God, his 86th birthday. It's as much a tribute to Elie Wiesel as it is a discussion on this most seminal of subjects, why it is that when it comes to genocide and the Jews, it is indeed a never-ending problem. I was only about 8 when I first discovered the monstrous crime of the extermination and annihilation of European Jewry. I still remember the first grainy black and white images that I saw of corpses, mounds of humanity being pushed by tractors into giant pits. I remember feeling that as an Orthodox Jewish child who was raised to be subservient before God, to submit to the divine will, I remember feeling that I had to speak out. Where was God when mothers begged for just drops of water to give to their children on cattle cars where they were deported from ghettos to death camps? Where was God when Mengele put on his immaculate white glove and pointed in a direction that would signify life or death? Where was God when a people who have been committed to his covenant and his tradition for 3.5 millennia were targeted for extermination by the world's greatest civilization? Why was he silent? And it was only when I read Night, it was only when I read the immortal words that are today inscribed on the very granite of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum of the Smithsonian. And what a country that would create a memorial to our people. What a country the United States is. It was only when I read those words, never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night. 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. It was when I read words like that that I felt that I finally had a voice, that my faith had been restored because my voice had been proclaimed, that I had a right to be an Israelite, he who wrestles with God, he who spars with God. Elie Wiesel reestablished the ancient tradition of the patriarchs and of the prophet Moses to shake the foundations of the heavens in the face of seeming divine miscarriages of justice. Like Abraham, who lifted his fist to the heavens, raising a cudgel and saying to God, who threatened to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, shall the judge of the entire earth not himself practice justice? Elie Wiesel gave us our place in the divine pantheon, that we are not just cosmic chaff, that we are not just brittle, insignificant humans, that we matter, that whether we live or die matters, that God, who said that we must choose life, must himself choose life, that if you are merciful, then where is your mercy? If you are compassionate, then show us your compassion. If you believe in the infinite value of life, then you must protect the living, and you must protect them from the evil designs of the wicked. Sitting with a living legend is something that transcends time, my friends. Hearing the moving, evocative voice that is so resonant of Elie Wiesel is an experience that can seldom be captured in words. And knowing the things that he has witnessed, how it made him feel, fills us with humility and with awe. I have had countless hours with Professor Wiesel, and I value every fragment of every second. It is an honor and a privilege, and I thank him when it wasn't easy to come this evening. When Rabbi Eliezer got us to bless you with health and with strength, I thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, Rabbi Eliezer. You are the glory of our people, and I am truly, truly blessed to be with you. My friends, just before I introduce a very special guest, I would like to publicly say that amidst the 57 books that have been international bestsellers and translated into 50-odd languages, amidst the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor bestowed by our great nation, amidst the Nobel Prize for Peace bestowed in 1986, amidst the countless honorary degrees from every leading university on earth, and amidst the French Legion of Honor, Rabbi Eliezer, your greatest legacy sits right before me, and he is your son Elisha, and your daughter-in-law Lynn, and the beautiful grandchildren, and Elisha is the living embodiment of your values, and without Elisha, there would have been no event this evening, and Elisha, I am personally indebted to you for your friendship and your kindness always. God bless you. Thank you. Which brings us to one of the world's incredible women. My friends, there's so much I can say about the American ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. I could tell you that Samantha, after Professor Wiesel, is the world's foremost voice against genocide, which is why it was my dream to put them together on the same stage. Mendy, you can come up. Mendy Boteach, who single-handedly organized this entire event, he's an undergraduate at NYU, is going to sit in for Professor Feldman until he arrives, so God bless you. Maybe we'll let you stay afterward as well. Okay. I can tell you that Samantha is the world's foremost voice against genocide after Professor Wiesel, which is why I want him to bring them on the same stage, because a year ago at this time, we had the third most important voice in world genocide, and that was President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, together with Professor Wiesel, and we wanted to perpetuate that great legacy of voices speaking out against the annihilation of innocent human beings, be they black or white, be they Protestant or Catholic, be they Jewish or Muslim, that every child and every human being is created equally in the image of God. I could also tell you that Samantha, well before becoming the representative of our nation to the world, to the United Nations, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for the most definitive book about genocide ever written, A Problem from Hell. It was a book that changed my life. I have bought it for countless friends, and I have quoted it in countless articles and speeches. I can tell you that Samantha is a daring, courageous American light unto the nations, who represents our people, the American people, with moral courage, with determination and tenacity, upholding the dignity of every man, woman, and child. But actually, the greatest compliment I can give to you, Samantha, is that I truly believe that Samantha Power is in and of herself enough of an argument for there to be a constitutional amendment that bars those who are not native-born Americans from being the president of the United States. You can give me an applause for that. I mean that sincerely. Samantha was born in Ireland and emigrated to this great country when she was 12. Rarely has the American people been more enriched by someone who joined this great nation like you, Samantha. And I have to tell you that this past Thursday, she gave a speech in Berlin that was one of the most courageous speeches against Jew hatred and anti-Semitism in modern world history. The speech is an absolute essential read on the part of every American citizen. I'm going to briefly quote some of the things because I asked her to do so herself, and she said that she is here tonight to give a tribute to Professor Wiesel, her friend, and someone who's had, I would like to believe, a seminal influence on your work, especially against genocide, Samantha. This is what she said in Berlin this past Thursday, November 13th. Anti-Semitic attacks, and she was the official representative of President Obama, and God bless President Obama for sending such a high-level delegation to the anti-Semitism conference in Berlin. She said, anti-Semitic attacks are not only a threat to the Jewish community, they are a threat to the larger project of European liberalism and pluralism, and should be treated as such. Anti-Semitism threatens the core principles upon which a peaceful and stable Europe has been built. Approximately 1 in 4 European Jews, Ambassador Power said, reported having been the victim of an anti-Semitic attack or harassment in the previous year. That is outrageous, my friends. That is vile, that's disgusting, that's unacceptable in the year 2014. In France, continuing in her speech, where Jews account for less than 1% of the population, in 2013 they were victims of 40% of reported attacks based on race, religion, and ethnicity. Samantha went on to say at rallies in Frankfurt and other cities in Germany, there were chants of Hamas, Hamas, Jews go to the gas, which is supposed to rhyme. It doesn't even do that. The same week, she continued, protesters marched on a synagogue in Paris, reportedly screaming, death to the Jews and Jews to the oven, and then tried to force themselves inside. Where worshipers were gathered, they were held at bay by security guards and police. I could go on. I want you to read this speech. I'm going to end by saying that here's what she concluded. There's an important lesson here, Ambassador Power said, as the American representative to a global conference on anti-Semitism, which is rearing its ugly head globally and especially in Europe. She said, rising anti-Semitism is rarely the lone or the last manifestation of intolerance in a society. Quite the contrary. It is often the canary in the coal mine for the degradation of human rights more broadly. When the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Jews are repressed, the rights and freedoms of other minorities and other sectors are not far behind. And we protest, she said, and defend universal human rights around the world, we must ensure that these efforts always include the human rights of Jews. It was for this reason that we wanted to organize this event so badly, as I introduced the ambassador, which is that about 6 or 7 weeks ago, President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority spoke to this very hall, to an audience that gave him an ovation. I'm an American citizen. I'm Jewish. I love Israel. I see it as a majestic, righteous, and just democracy that upholds human freedoms, that upholds human rights, that stands up for the dignity of every woman, that allows, not just allows, but gay men have the largest gay pride parade anywhere in the Middle East, which isn't saying much, although it's one of the biggest parades anywhere in the world, because a gay man can be an equal citizen, because he's an equal child of God like every other person. And I'm someone who believes in the first chapter of Genesis that every human being is created in the image of God, that every Palestinian child is the equal of a Jewish child. But if our people are maligned, we must respond. When President Mahmoud Abbas left the stage and went 2 days later before the United Nations General Assembly and fraudulently and falsely accused Israel of a genocide against the Palestinians, repeating the oldest canard in the book, that the Jews are guilty of a blood libel, this time on a collective mass scale, against every available shred of evidence to the contrary, because Israel gives more human rights to Arab citizens than any country in the Middle East, it requires a response. I have no problem with people criticizing Israel. God knows Israel's fallible, human, and makes tons of mistakes. But I am absolutely opposed to defamation of the Jewish people, to character assassination and slander. And when I discussed this with Professor Wiesel, and he said to me, Shmuley, don't worry, the people will not necessarily believe it's true. I reminded him, and I've never taught Elie Wiesel anything in my entire life. I reminded him that when they said we killed God, the world believed them. When they said that we drank the blood of Christian children in our matzahs, nobody thought, so absurd, it's impossible, and the world believed it. When they said that we poisoned the wells of Europe and created the bubonic plague, the world believed it. So I have to respond, because I've discovered that anything said about our people somehow is believable. The Jewish people are not perfect, but God Almighty, if we're not the way we are portrayed, and we will respond. My friends, ladies and gentlemen, what an honor for this organization, and for me personally, and Professor Wiesel, to recognize and welcome a phenomenal light of the American people to the world, Ambassador Samantha Power.
Thank you, Shmuley, for having me here. Thank you, Elie, for being here. And thanks to all of you for coming to see a great man in action. Elie Wiesel has said, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness." Those of us who are blessed not to have borne witness to Nazism have an everlasting duty to remember. And so we must teach our children and our children's children what happened. We must never let them feel as though the Holocaust was last century's genocide, a remote historical event. We must always ensure that while the photos and film footage of the Holocaust are in black and white, we teach the facts in color. The racist evil that brought forth the terrible order of the Nuremberg laws and the unspeakable destruction of Kristallnacht. The roving Einsatzgruppen exterminating the richness of Ashkenazi Jewry, the heroic Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the infernos of Auschwitz and Treblinka. More than that, though, we will always commemorate the richness of Jewish history and identity, something that runs vastly deeper than the genocide perpetrated by the Nazis. Hitler wanted to murder Jews and also to murder Judaism, to murder Jewish religion and civilization, and in that he failed. What Nazis did to Jews in those terrible dozen years of Hitler's reign will always be a part of Jewish history, and each and every one of the murdered 6 million deserves to be memorialized for his or her individual life, as he or she wanted to lead that life. They deserve to be remembered for their love of family or their study of Torah, for their secularism or their spirituality, for their mitzvot and tzedakah. They were professors and laborers, landholders and landless, inhabitants of tiny Polish villages, and cosmopolitan artists and engineers, mothers and fathers, and they were children. So many kids. One of those children grew up to be the man we are honoring tonight. He was a little boy named Elie. Today we know him as a moral inspiration, but before he had that burden inflicted upon him, he was a child who had the terrible misfortune to be born a Jew in Eastern Europe in 1928. He's just one of millions, and we should tell all of their stories. But before we hear from Elie tonight, I'd just like to say a few words about him. In another time or another place, Elie Wiesel might have grown up to be a distinguished Talmudic scholar. He was adept in his studies and most sincere in his piety. While his father ran a store in the little Transylvanian town of Siget, Elie's place was in learning. He was so precocious that he wanted to study the highly advanced mysticism of the Kabbalah and found an unlikely guide in his studies. Moshe the Beetle, as the villagers called him, was an impoverished, shy, awkward man who worked at the shul, who studied the mysteries of the Zohar with a teenage Elie. Then one day the Hungarian police shoved all the foreign Jews into cattle cars, and Moshe the Beetle, a foreigner, was gone. After several months, late in 1942, he returned. He told Elie what had happened to him. He and the other foreign Jews had been hauled away to Poland, passed to the Gestapo, and herded into a forest. They were forced to dig trenches, and then they were shot dead. Jewish babies were thrown into the air for target practice, Moshe said. It is hard to imagine a human being capable of committing such unconscionable horror, but this was what Moshe the Beetle described. Moshe had been wounded in the leg and left for dead. He managed to make his way back to Siget and told people what he had seen. "Jews, listen to me," he shouted. But people wouldn't listen. They would not and they could not believe. They thought he was imagining it or had gone mad. They ignored him and life went back to normal. The villagers listened to encouraging news from London radio, heard of Stalingrad and the preparations for the opening of a second front, and hoped for, Allied victory. And then, in the spring of 1944, the German army came to Siget. After what Elie Wiesel endured in the subsequent months in Auschwitz and then Buchenwald, after the death of his father in the waning days of the war in January 1945, he would have been more than justified to sit in silence for a lifetime. This orphan teenager could have mourned privately for his parents, for his little sister, for his grandfather. He could have put the past in the past somehow. But instead of silence, as you all know well, he chose to invest in words. After his liberation and his studies in France, he decided to record what he had endured. There could be nothing more painful than reliving what it was like to be in Auschwitz. But though he knew uniquely that it was structurally impossible for words to capture his experience, he bent his will and his words to this task. As he put it once in writing, "Only those who experienced Auschwitz know what it was. Others will never know. But would they at least understand?" Part of why we have generations of children read Night is so they can learn the uniquely unspeakable history of the Holocaust itself. And in that respect, the impression the book has left on so many is searing. But there's another reason we have our children read Night. For most children, Night constitutes their first encounter with the bleakest darkness of the world and with the moral choices that world presents. It shows not only the evil of the executioners, but also the moral agency of those who could have been upstanders but chose instead to be bystanders. Elie forbids us from being passive observers in his story. To read Night is to ask, what would I have done? How would I have behaved differently? Even more, to read Night is also to ask, what am I doing? What am I doing to stop atrocities in my time? Just as when we say never again, we are making a commitment that goes beyond defending the Jewish people, so too when we read Night, we are reading a book whose lessons go beyond even the Holocaust. Elie, of course, understood all this. He understood that Night was part of a larger, timeless, universal project, to be ever vigilant against the kind of hatreds that could give rise to genocide, to sound the alarm and to act. And Elie has not only taught this lesson, he has lived by it. Time and again, he has been our siren and our compass. In 1985, when he was being honored at the White House, a normally placid affair, Elie used the occasion to urge President Reagan not to visit the Bitburg Military Cemetery, which include the graves of Waffen-SS soldiers. "I've seen the SS at work," he said, "and I've seen their victims. They were my friends, they were my parents." In his Nobel Peace Prize speech in 1986, he spoke not only of the persecuted Jews in the Soviet Union and inside Arab countries, but also of persecuted Poles, Black South Africans, and Palestinians. In 1993, as Bosnia was burning, Elie turned to speak directly to President Clinton at the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, declaring, "I have been in the former Yugoslavia last fall. I cannot sleep since for what I have seen. As a Jew, I am saying that we must do something to stop the bloodshed in that country." And in 2006, Elie visited the UN to urge action to stop the slaughter being carried out by the Sudanese government against the people of Darfur. The list goes on. It is sad to observe that the lessons in Night are ones we need to keep teaching. As many of you know, and as Shmuley has now described, we are witnessing an alarming surge of anti-Semitism in Europe. Far-right, racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic political parties like Hungary's Jobbik Party and Greece's Golden Dawn are rising dramatically in popularity. Attacks on Jews are rising. According to the recent European Union Fundamental Rights Agency survey of the 8 countries in which more than 90% of Europe's Jews live, more than 1 in 4 Jews reported having been the victim of an anti-Semitic attack or harassment in the previous year. 1 in 4. So too are attacks rising on places of worship and historical significance to the Jewish people, such as the attack on the Brussels Jewish Museum in May, which killed 4 people, and the July firebombing in Wuppertal of the Bergische Synagogue, which had originally been burned to the ground during Kristallnacht and had only been rebuilt in 2002. So it was particularly alarming to discover that, in spite of this alarming trend, when I last week attended the second ever OSCE conference dedicated to combating anti-Semitism, 1/3 fewer countries participated than took part in the 2004 conference. And only 1 in 3 of the countries that sent a foreign minister or other cabinet-level official back in 2004 on an OSCE conference, the only other OSCE conference on combating anti-Semitism, only 1 in 3 of those countries sent a minister or cabinet-level official this year. It was the kind of showing that I know Elie would have called out. "Where are you?" he would have said. So I took a page from Elie's book and asked that same question to the group of diplomats who had gathered. Sort of an awkward silence in the wake of that question. What can one say? It's not like the problem's going anywhere. The problem's getting worse, and yet high-level attention is going down. What's up with that? At the same time, I cannot tell you how inspiring it was at the same conference in Berlin to look out at the American civil society organization that had journeyed there for this conference. Not only Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, but other groups like the American Islamic Congress and a leading Sikh organization, civil rights groups like the NAACP, and the largest U.S. advocacy group for LGBT rights, the Human Rights Campaign. The richness of the American civil society delegation in Berlin at a conference dedicated to combating anti-Semitism is a testament to a lesson that Elie has taught us all, that anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish issue, it is a human rights issue. A world where the human rights of Jews are at risk is a world where all of our rights are at risk. That understanding is a legacy of Night, and because Night has been taught for generations in this country to millions of school kids, I believe we all grew up internalizing this deep truth. One of the most horrifyingly efficient massacres during the Holocaust occurred in a forest ravine near Kiev at Babi Yar, where Nazis and their collaborators massacred 33,771 Jews in less than 2 days. In 1943, as the Red Army pushed back the Nazis on the Eastern Front, the Nazis set about trying to destroy the evidence of their carnage. At Babi Yar, they dug up the mass graves and unearthed the bodies that they contained. They burned those bodies in massive piles and brought in huge machines to pulverize the bones. There were so many bodies that it took them a month working around the clock to destroy all of them. They were determined to leave no trace. This effort at Babi Yar exemplified the Nazis' effort to expunge the Jewish people from history, from the planet and from history. Of course they failed. We know today what happened in Babi Yar and in Auschwitz and in Buchenwald and in so many other places. But perhaps the ultimate paradox of the Nazi effort was that it gave birth to a movement that in many, many ways the man seated behind me, Elie Wiesel, helped to create. A movement to prevent genocide, not only against the Jews, but against people of any ethnicity or religion who would be targeted as such. And today, this could include Yazidis and Christians in Iraq. Tomorrow, it could include other groups. That movement exists, and that movement exists because so much of our moral architecture was defined by what we read at a young age, thanks to Elie Wiesel's willingness to bend his pen and bend those words to capture history and to capture the moral choices that each of us have. Now, the work that Elie Wiesel has started, needless to say, is unfinished. We will always have to be guarding against threats, and we have to infuse his life's work, this essential work, with the spirit of new generations. More than 10 million people now have read Night. Millions more than the 6 million Jews who were exterminated in the Holocaust. Millions more will read it. Its impact is immeasurable. How horrific it is that it was the Holocaust, it took the Holocaust to give birth to this effort. Yet how amazing it is to know that my children and my children's children, and Elie, your grandchildren, will one day open the pages of Night and be forced to ask themselves the ever-important questions. What would I have done? And what will I now do? Thank you, Elie, for all you have done and all you continue to do. Thank you for being such a voice and such a friend to me and so many people around the world who have never had the chance to say thank you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. We're going to move the podium, please. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what an honor to hear the American ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, and one of the world's foremost authorities on genocide. Professor Noah Feldman is in travel limbo, but he will be joining us, God willing. And Rabbi Eliezer, let me, and everyone I have called Elie Wiesel, Rabbi Eliezer. It's an affectionate term for the past quarter century, so I plan to do so this evening as well. Rabbi Eliezer, what is the reason for anti-Semitism?
Why ask me? Ask the anti-Semite. Occasionally I meet some and I ask. They don't know why. It's there. Is it as old as Jewish history? Can it have been different? Could we have avoided anti-Semitism? It began when? I don't know, Jacob and Esau, or later on, when? How does one produce such a desire to hurt other people only because of their faith, or their religion, or whoever, what, why? What is the reason of all that? What good can it do? It comes to anti-Semitism, which I believe to be the oldest group hatred in recorded history. The oldest. There were so many other fanaticisms. They disappeared. Religious fanaticism, political fanaticism, they have been disappeared. Anti-Semitism is the oldest, and it's still here. Why? What do they want from us? Simply not to exist? But why? What wrong could we have done to elicit such hatred? If there was such hatred, and there was, of course. There isn't a method that the enemy hasn't used. There isn't a reason they haven't invented. Somehow we were guilty of everything, even of God's killing, Christ's killing. Imagine the absurdity to accuse the people of killing its God. But we paid for it. Hundreds and thousands of victims because of this stupid accusation. And yet, here we are. And you know me already, my favorite expression is, and yet. And yet, okay. It means they have done everything possible for us not to be here, and yet we are here.
Rabbi Eliezer, did you think that in your, I know the sound system is a little bit, so I'm going to phrase the questions with a little bit of the content that he just said, speaking about the world's oldest hatred and doesn't understand why the world won't allow the Jews alone, and that it's destructive to the world, not just to the Jewish people. Samantha kind of captured that in her speech in Berlin, that it's a violation of European principles. But Rabbi Eliezer, did you think that in your 86th year, thank God, and it's been 70 years since you were a teenager in Auschwitz, did you think it would be so strong today?
No, in the beginning I thought that, paradoxically, because of what happened,
Professor Noah Feldman, how are you?
because of what happened, we cannot imagine history without it. It happened. Where did we go wrong? That's the real question I have. We Jews, where did we go wrong? Did we go wrong, let's say, 2,000 years ago when we left to Babylon, left to Paris, to France? We could have stayed in the land of the prophets and stayed there. Small minority, go on living. What did we do to deserve such hatred? Because we believed in the same God, obviously, but a different approach to God. For this, when you study, and occasionally when I teach the history of the Jewish people, the philosophy of that history is extraordinary. Why? You ask yourself, why? For so many centuries, some stupid accusations that we killed their God. Why God? You can't even pronounce all these stupidities there. We had nothing else to do than to kill them. Our whole life. And yet it caught on. Without anti-Semitism, which I believe to be the oldest mass inspiring hatred in history, anti-Semitism is today as strong as it has been 1,800 years ago, 1,600 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Things change, regimes change, ideologies change, anti-Semitism remains. You want to tell me today there are no more anti-Semites in the world? Of course there are. True, there is no organized anti-Semitism. That is true. It's not elegant to be called an anti-Semite. Because anti-Semitism then would mean racism. It's not nice to be a racist. But in general, there's something about the Jew that we simply pose a question to the world: what are we still doing here after 2,000 years? What are we doing here in history? If you are religious, you say, Rabbi Shalom, master of the universe. If you don't want us, then tell us. Just tell us so. You have chosen us in our people. Say so. For what? For suffering? For more deportations and more plague? What more? Look, as a good student, I am a believer in questions. And I try to deepen these questions to this day.
But here's the key question, and I waited for actually Samantha to depart the stage before asking this, because Samantha's a good friend and I never want my views to ever be superimposed on the American ambassador to the United Nations. This is my question. I think the key question for a lot of people in the world Jewish community today, and other people who love and support the state of Israel, are the incessant attacks on Israel a form of anti-Semitism, or are they legitimate political criticism? In other words, I showed you in the stage behind, just before the speech, the headlines today, the headline of the Huffington Post today was that the European Union, there's a leaked document that they may be enacting economic sanctions against the state of Israel. That's a breathtaking headline. There are no sanctions against China for occupying Tibet since 1950. I could go on. I'm not here to focus specifically on other countries. But there seems to be such unwarranted attacks on Israel. And one of the reasons I wanted Mindy was to even talk about the experience of students here at NYU and other campuses. Is hatred of Israel or attacks on Israel a form of anti-Semitism?
Shmuley, remember the Talmudic saying, Esav Soine Leyanka, Keyadua. It's known. Esau hates his brother, Jacob, which means they hate Jews. It's as old as the war between brothers, between Esau and Jacob. Why? There are so many books, hundreds. I think I have read them all, hundreds and hundreds. The genealogy of anti-Semitism, the psychology of anti-Semitism, the so-called philosophy of anti-Semitism. Whatever whatever you do, somehow you stumble on it. Sometimes you are even astonished. In the 30s, for instance, Europe was not immune to anti-Semitism, even among the intellectuals. The intellectual communities, let's say in France and elsewhere, they cannot believe it. They were anti-Semitic. You read today their books, you can't believe it. They were published in those years, anti-Semitic books, written by famous writers, some of them with Nobel Prizes.
But they love you in France. They love you.
After the war. I came there after the war. Had I been there during the war, would they have hidden me? You know, I came to France after the war. I remember among the first lessons I received there is, they told me, look, for every Jew who is alive, you have to thank a Frenchman. But also for every Jew who was not alive anymore, you have to accuse a Frenchman.
Well, I'm going to assume that you're diplomatically tiptoeing around the answer, Rabbi Eliezer, but if you say that anti-Semitism is almost something endemic and congenital, that it's going to apply to the Jewish state. So I'm going to turn to, almost as a matter of course, I'm going to turn to our newly arrived panelists. Let me just say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy that Professor Noah Feldman of Harvard, the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard, and one of the world's great constitutional experts, and the advisor to the coalition government in writing the Iraqi constitution. I go on, academic superstar here at NYU, where you spent so many years, and now at Harvard. I'm so happy you're late, because I've never seen you make any mistakes or do anything wrong in your entire life, Noah. This act of imperfection, of true humanity, has given me a greater sense of equality before you. Noah and I have known each other also for about almost 25 years. We used to study together at Oxford, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. I was his rabbi. You try teaching him anything. It's not easy. That itself was a humbling experience. And you missed one key line. I was going to turn to you when I introduced Ambassador Power. I said that Samantha is the best argument for there to be a constitutional amendment that bars anyone but native-born Americans from being president. So when, God willing, you're on the United States Supreme Court, we expect you to be the one that makes that change, Noah. So you heard it here first. So I'm going to put you in the hot spot. I'm going to challenge you tonight, okay? And thank you so much for the efforts you made amidst this incredible storm to be here this evening. Is criticism, hatred, let's say, there seems to be a lot of unfair criticism of Israel. Is that a form of anti-Semitism?
Before I try to answer, let me just first apologize to you, Shmuley, and to you, Dr. Wiesel, and especially to Ambassador Power for being late. I'm really, really sorry. And to the audience. Let me, if I've left anybody out, I'm not sure. My mom's over there. I'm sorry for something.
We have a seat. We have a seat for your mom, and I was wondering why she. Okay. Well.
So there they are. Okay. So let me begin trying to approach this question, which is an extraordinarily serious question, by saying that, first of all, there can be criticism of Israel that does not take the form of anti-Semitism. And I imagine that we all agree with that, because under some circumstances, we've all, in public or private, said things that were critical of a particular policy or action of the State of Israel. And because Israel is a democracy, it needs its own citizens to criticize it, and it therefore needs people who visit it and think about it and care about it to criticize it. And furthermore, because Israel is a state and not the manifestation solely of a religion, it can't be the case that to criticize it necessarily entails you in criticism of the religion. If it were, there would be no difference between the state and the faith, and that's not the design of the State of Israel, nor should it be. At the same time, it's obviously the case that it's possible to criticize Israel from anti-Semitic motives. And that leaves us with an extremely difficult quandary when we think about a particular form of criticism, or criticism of Israel more generally, namely that we have to figure out whether the particular criticism is derived from anti-Semitic sources or isn't. And just to make the problem a little bit deeper, we also all know that it's possible to have correct views for the wrong reasons. In fact, I often think that any correct views that I by chance have are probably for the wrong reasons. So you could imagine somebody who makes a genuine and real criticism of Israel, but does so from motives of anti-Semitism. That's also a possibility. So these are all possibilities, I think, in the range. And the hard part is trying to figure it out case by case and to be attentive to and aware of the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism and its risks, without that leading us to think that anything that takes the form of a criticism of Israel is necessarily anti-Semitic, which, as I said, I think can't be right, and I don't think anybody actually believes that that would be true of all criticisms.
But I did say just before you arrived, and by the way, you owe me big time. I stalled big time waiting for you to come. I want you to know that. Just gave me more time to speak. It was wonderful. I did say before you arrived, Noach, that when Professor Wiesel and I were speaking, and when we wanted to organize this evening, because Mahmoud Abbas, who spoke here, accused Israel of genocide at the UN, which seems to trade often in constant criticisms, attacks, condemnations, resolutions against Israel, that it would be believed, that the genocide would be believed. And I spoke to you on the phone, and you said you think that would not be believed. Professor Wiesel just said he can't believe that they said that we killed Jesus and the world believed it, but he said that millions of Jews paid with their lives for that allegation. And maybe the Jewish people are constantly thinking, you know what, we don't have to respond to this because it's ridiculous. You can't kill God. God is omnipotent. God is all-powerful. You can't kill God. And yet, I know people up until 20 years ago who were being beaten up in American public schools because they said, you killed Jesus. So do you really believe that these allegations will not gain currency?
Well, let me say something about the structure of rhetoric in politics. The form of criticism that says that Israel is genocidal, which I think is false as a statement of fact and false as a statement of law, has a political power in part because Israel is connected in the minds of many, many people to the European attempt, much too late, to atone in some way for the genocide of the Shoah. And that means, although that's not the rationale that the early Zionists had for creating the State of Israel, since they were interested in creating the State of Israel long before the Holocaust, that means that the rationale for Israel is bound up in many people's minds with the phenomenon of genocide. And in politics, one of the most skillful rhetorical things you can do is take an argument in favor of your opponent and flip it on its head and try to use it against him. And therefore, by saying to Israel, you're committing genocide, the rhetorical goal is to delegitimate not simply Israel's actions, for example, in Gaza, but to delegitimate the justifiability of the state at all in the first place. To say, well, some people think you deserve your state because of a genocide, but if you've committed a genocide, or you're in the process of committing one, then you never had a right to the state in the first place. And that's a very skillful piece of political rhetoric because it pivots off of the initial presumption that part of Israel's reason for existing or right to exist is connected to the genocide. And I think that's one of the reasons for its rhetorical effect. And the thing about rhetoric is nobody has to believe it the first time it's said, or the second, or the third. But eventually, a rhetorical point that's repeated can begin to take on weight. I think just one other point about this. I think that the degree of criticism of Israel with respect to the situation of Palestinians is connected to an intuition that is probably a morally correct intuition, namely that all peoples should have the right, if possible, to live freely in a space of their own. I say that that's probably a correct intuition because without it there would be no argument for the state of Israel, or at least there would be no secular argument. And I'm convinced that if the only argument for the existence of the state of Israel is that God gave the land to the forefathers of the Jewish people, that's not a sufficient justification in the secular world for the creation of a state. That might be a sufficient religious justification. But then that simply puts us into a debate between people of different faiths who say, well, no, the country belongs to me. And that can't be the right way to think about it. So given that there's an intuition that different peoples should be able to live on their own, in their own states, it's natural, perhaps, to think that if one is not living that way, then its status as a nation is being some way impugned. And the concept of genocide is bound up with the idea of the nation state, or at least of the nation. It's bound up with the idea that a people has a special right to exist. And that's why it's worse to destroy a nation than simply to destroy all of the people, the same number of people, without trying to destroy an entire nation. So there's a kind of associative logic there. I don't think it's correct in this case, but you can see the associative logic of it.
But Professor Wiesel also said that when it comes to genocide, there's nothing really, and the Jews, there's nothing logical about it. Professor Wiesel quotes the Talmud, who says that there's almost something endemic, halacha, sona esav Yaakov, that there's something congenital about the, dislike of the Jewish people, that it's not logical. And when it comes to genocide, we seem to have this bizarre relationship with genocide. Which other nation at the UN had someone like Ahmadinejad getting up and calling for their being wiped off the map and constant threats of annihilation? You can't threaten a UN member state. Which other nation is accused of trying to perpetrate a genocide against all the evidence? We have this strange relationship with genocide. And one of the things that, and this is the second year in a row, we were lucky. I think we've now had the three biggest names in world genocide on this panel. Professor Wiesel with Paul Kagame last year, and now with Samantha. Mendy, I wanted you to address, as an NYU graduate, you decided to protest Mahmoud Abbas's presence here. But no one else really did. It's funny because you got all over the media because you were the only guy. What is the experience of students here at Cooper Union, NYU, when it comes to Israel and anti-Semitism? Are these real legitimate concerns, or are they Jewish paranoia?
First of all, I want to say what an incredible honor it is for me to be sitting next to Professor Elie Wiesel. Just after my bar mitzvah, I had a chance to go on an airplane with him to a speech he was giving in Utah. And it's one of the most memorable and inspirational experiences of my life. And to be up here with him is something that I never thought I deserved and still don't, and definitely not something I ever imagined.
You organized the whole event, so you deserved it. Go ahead.
I think when my father told me to actually come up here, he said it like in an email together with like, don't forget to buy index cards to be given out. He just kind of threw it in with like some, and I didn't think he was serious, but a true honor. What it is about campus and why I think campus is so important, and honestly this, the battle as I see it for Israel is actually one of the things that drew me towards campus, that at my age, if I wanted to defend the land of the Jewish people, I thought campus offered a special opportunity to do so. Because it's kind of like a microcosm. It's almost like a preview for what the debate will be in 4 or 5 years. It all kind of starts in college. Things that seem crazy now on a news station are perfectly acceptable on campus. Anything flies. I mean, there are libertarians and communists everywhere. I mean, that's just the way college works. And these allegations of genocide, I first saw them on the university scene. This past summer, we had 2 world leaders accuse Israel of genocide. Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey and Mahmoud Abbas, actually just 4 days after he stood over here, and I protested him. 4 days later, it was a Monday, I believe on Friday, was when his accusations came. And I'm a little bit lost. But on the universities 4 years ago, I mean, that's really where it started. Now it's already hit the mainstream, 2 world leaders. But 4 years ago, this is what was circulating in campuses. And, especially about genocide, what it is that, throughout history, I took a course last year in genocide, and what you learn is that throughout history, it's actually been very often ignored. It's never really made it to people's priorities list. During, the Armenian genocide is still not recognized by our country. As I believe President Obama, for the 6th year running, refused to call it a genocide this past April. The Jewish genocide, the Allies' powers refused to stop it. I mean, it's hard to judge. They were running a war, but still, it was not on their list of priorities. After they conquered Italy, they could have bombed the tracks. They could have bombed the Auschwitz death camp, and in fact, they even bombed the munitions factories near Auschwitz with the planes flying right over the prisoners' heads, but they did not bomb the camps. And then in Indonesia in 1965, which it's debatable whether it was a genocide or a politicide, but in any case, 500,000 to 1 million people were slaughtered, and I bet most of the people in this room don't even know anything happened in Indonesia in 1965. And even if you fast forward to the Rwanda genocide, again, massive failure and negligence on the part of the world. And now with the Yazidis this past summer in Iraq, I don't recall one street demonstration anywhere in the world saying, help the Yazidis, they're about to be killed for who they are as a nation, as a people. Thank God Obama stepped in and launched airstrikes to save them when they were circled on a mountain, but did not catch the world's attention. This is not something that most people have on their minds, except in the case of Israel. Suddenly there are demonstrations in the streets. Suddenly there are articles on campus newspapers. And that's why on campus, it really seemed to me that this was more than just legitimate criticism, that this was something more malicious. It wasn't care for human rights, because human rights don't get that much news on campus. This was an attack on Israel for being a Jewish state, especially in the nature of the attack of a genocide. So, for me, as a student here, I think this is where the conversation is headed down the line. That right now you just have 2 world leaders in the next Gaza conflict, because right now it seems like it'll be coming again. There'll be even more, and it'll only get closer and closer to joining the mainstream conversation.
Oh, the beauty of being a student, being able to say whatever you want. So let me quickly add. Let me quickly add, because of my deep, sincere, and heartfelt respect for Samantha and everything that she does, that President Obama and your defense of the Yazidis, saving their lives, was remarkable. And what the United States is doing to fight ISIS is remarkable. And Samantha, everything you do every day to preserve and protect human life with President Obama is remarkable, and we're all extremely grateful, especially for the Obama administration's phenomenal support, military, diplomatic, especially at the UN, support for the state of Israel. We're extremely grateful, and God bless you, and God bless the President. Rabbi Eliezer, so that's interesting. So Mendy is saying, well, you know what? They do single the Jews out, even when they're not guilty of these horrible atrocities. And maybe, what is it that they go after the name of the Jewish people all the time? Like, they're always saying that we're such bad people, as you said, that we murdered this deity, or that we murdered these children. Why is anti-Semitism expressed specifically with the Jews as murderers? There's also the Jews as, connivers, thieves. But specifically, this charge of murder, of indiscriminate slaughter, why does this express itself that way?
It's not that simple. It's not expressed like that. The expression is Esav soneh Yaakov. Talmud says, Esau hated his brother Jacob. Halacha keyadua. It is the halacha as it is known. Which is a very strange combination of words there. But the thing is, we don't understand. It's as old as Jewish history itself. Why? What did we do to deserve that? We came out with ideas, ideologies of conquest. We didn't want to conquer. We wanted more. What did we want, really? For 2,000 years, what did the Jewish people want?
So they're saying that we want world conquest. Where do these ideas come from?
Oh, they come only from the, first of all, stupidity. It's just stupid.
But it's a malicious form of stupidity, Rabbi Eliezer. It's a very dangerous form of stupidity.
But to say, come on.
Stupidity can be benign.
Nevertheless, come on. To accuse the Jewish people, these Jews, the Jews were according to our enemies, that they are those who exploit other people's suffering, those who exploit other people's work, those who are always lying, cheaters. Anything bad, anything negative is about the Jewish character in their mind. Why did they choose Jews? At one point, in some places, they took the gypsies, for instance. In Eastern Europe, where I come from, anti-Semitism was part of life. But in addition to that, they also hated gypsies. I always felt sorry for the gypsies. so sorry. We had a gypsy community in every village and every city, and they were ostracized. Why? They were treated as thieves. Nonsense. Come on, they were poor beggars going from house to house, begging for bread. Why? It's there.
And you've been at the forefront of insisting with the United States Holocaust Museum that the gypsies, that the Roma people be embraced in that museum as equal victims as the Jews. You insisted on that when the museum was first arranged. Is it jealousy? Now, you say that the gypsies, they accused them of X, Y, and Z, but they had nothing. They were impoverished. They faced penury. Maybe they hate the Jewish people because they're successful, or they claim they're successful. I remember the first speech you gave for us at Oxford 25 years ago. You said that you also believed that the genocide of the Jews was in part due to confiscate Jewish property. Hitler needed money to fund his war machine.
No,
Is it jealousy?
In addition,
Like Israel is a successful, a prosperous country now, thank God. Is that part of it?
oh, jealousy also, but not only jealousy. I'm sure it has some religious elements, which went from generation to generation to generation. And without knowing it, 2,000 years, the Jews killed Christ and we killed their God. Oh, hey, it's something. The Jewish people killed their own God. As if you could kill God, try. Just try. But all the stupidities. But I am surprised when I study the history of anti-Semitism, which is as old actually as European Jewish history. But the main thing is the stupidity of the argument. How could an intelligent
Meaning that
person
the allegations
believe
are
that?
so ridiculous and yet they become believable. But that's why we wanted to respond. Reza, let me ask you one final thing on this note. Samantha said last week, Samantha, you said in your speech, Europe has come a long way from the horrors of Kristallnacht. Today is not 1938. Genocide of the Jews in Europe is thankfully not a threat in 2014. Yet on the other hand, in the decade that has passed, 55 countries came together to declare our commitment to combating anti-Semitism, but we've still actually seen an alarming increase. Is Samantha correct that a genocide of the Jews is impossible? Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying that he's very concerned, at least she said it in Europe, I want to quote you accurately. But Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying, and he wants President Obama and the administration, the American people, and the UN to take the threat from Iran seriously, because Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has used very incendiary language, saying that he destroy Israel, annihilate Israel. Is a genocide of the Jews possible today, or is that likewise stupidity?
Genocide means the extinction, the extermination of an entire people. Is that possible? Of course not. That's possible only if the Jews live in one place.
6 million now live in one place.
In one place at the same time, threatened by the same enemy, and which would increase in numbers. Otherwise, I don't think it's possible today. Also, Israel, come on, Israel.
But it's an eerie number, 6 million in Israel. It's a very eerie number.
Nevertheless, Israel is a strong country. The miracle of history is Israel. All of a sudden, hey, how did we do that? I occasionally speak to Israeli generals. I meet them. I've never been in an army. I don't know what it is. And I admire them. Whenever there is an Israel war, I went to war in Israel. To be there at least. To be there, just to be there. Every war was there.
But Rabbi Eliezer, even if Israel is good at defending itself, it becomes a little country kind of marginalized by the rest of the world. It becomes very difficult to defend itself. Noach, is that the explanation for the charges of genocide against the Jews and anti-Semitism? Professor Wiesel says Israel's a strong country, it can defend itself. But what if you character assassinate a nation and say they're guilty of crimes? Then you have neutralized their military. They can no longer really use the military, because every time you use it, you're bombing children, you're destroying schools, you're attacking a civilian population. Suddenly, you're fighting with two hands tied behind your back. Is that the purpose of these accusations and allegations?
Well, I think the first stage is to try to figure out, as you've been trying to do, whether we are going to rely on a theological explanation for the presence of anti-Israel sentiment.
What do you think about that?
Or whether to rely on, or to seek after some other possible explanations. And I'll say why I think that really matters. Because if you're committed to the view that hatred of Israel is either rooted in a theology and has in some ways outlived that theology, or if you're committed to the view that it's a theological truth that Israel will always, that Esau will always hate Jacob, then there's no longer any reason to ask yourself how Jews or Israel more generally should alter its behavior in the face of criticism, except to say the answer is simply to be strong. Right? So I just want to be really clear. Yeah, if you think that anti-Semitism is inevitable, permanent, and a theological truth, you're not going to do anything about it. So by the same token, if you begin by saying, well, what could Israel do differently that might have an impact on anti-Semitism, you run the risk in that moment of blaming Israel for anti-Semitic views that are in the world. So it seems to me that neither is going to be the right way to go. I don't want to commit myself in the practical, real world to the view that anti-Semitism has a theological explanation, because frankly, even if that's true, that resigns me to a kind of position of quiescence where I can't do anything about it.
Except be strong.
Except be strong, which I think people want to be in any case. And, I similarly don't want to go down the road of saying, well, let's begin to evaluate the features of anti-Semitism in the criticism of Israel, lest I come across as saying that somehow Israel has caused anti-Semitic attitudes towards it, which I think is not universally or inevitably the case. So that's sort of a first caveat, just a statement of caution, as much to myself as to anybody else. The thing about making a statement of caution is then, of course, you want to break it. And, I do think that while it's the case that Israel would be criticized by some people, no matter what it did, and while it's the case that there are many people in the world who think that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, and therefore would continue to criticize it and deny its right to exist even if there were a Palestinian state existing alongside it, it's also true that a situation in which we to some degree appear to be now, in which, without getting into the complexities of explanations, historical explanations, in which it seems as though there's no realistic prospect of a two-state arrangement in the immediate future, that world is a world in which anti-Semitism will have fertile ground to grow. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that if there were, I think I said this a moment ago, but let me just say it again. I'm not saying that if there were a two-state solution tomorrow, anti-Semitism would magically disappear, or even that everybody would accept Israel's right to exist. Many people still would not. But those things can be true, and it can still be true that in a world where it appears that Israel's presence in, you can call it the West Bank and Gaza, you can call it Judea and Samaria, I'm not particular about the names, where that presence appears to be permanent to many observers, that's an environment where there will be criticism of Israel, and some of that criticism is likely to verge into anti-Semitism. So, one practical thing that could be proposed is to try to do what several governments of Israel, including the Netanyahu government, have formally said is their policy, what every government of the United States has formally said has been its policy since Oslo, and actually work to try to make a two-state solution a reality, which, if nothing else, would provide a response to people who say that there is a genocide perpetrated by Israel because of its desire to eliminate the Palestinian people. Now, people will still say that, but it would be easier and more straightforward to point out its falsehood. So, I think I'm trying to say this very delicately because I don't want to be heard to be saying that this would solve all problems, or that it's the cause of anti-Semitism. Of course it isn't. As Professor Wiesel said, that's a very complicated question. But I don't, by the same token, want to fall back on this idea that it's all theological, because if it's all theological, why do we have politics? Why do we have the United Nations? Why do we have a government? We don't need those things in a world of theology.
True.
I prefer to operate in a world as if the theological explanations weren't sufficient, because that's the real world in which power actually can be deployed, and with any luck, deployed for good.
Oh, I'm with you. And when we were at Oxford, that was the whole purpose of our L'chaim Society, which was to kind of bring a universal Jewish message that could apply to Jew, non-Jew alike, get Israel's message out without being dogmatic about it. But no, a lot of people are just kind of fed up. They don't know how else to explain it. They don't understand it. I mean, Samantha's speech in Berlin. Berlin, in the streets of places like Germany, they're marching and saying that Jews to the gas. Germany, of all places? Or the streets of Paris or the streets of London? We're kind of flummoxed. The mind is boggled by what Professor Wiesel calls...
that's all true.
It just won't... And it kind of reaches a place where you finally say, maybe the only thing is to be strong.
Let me make one...
Or the experience of students here. Why should Jewish students have to feel intimidated? I'm going to come to you, Mendy, think about that, because why should students have to feel intimidated on university campuses? I don't mind if Israeli speakers who come to speak for Israel are challenged, criticized. God Almighty, you know that we love the debate, and we organize debates. What I can't stand is Israeli speakers that are shouted down on every campus, Israeli ambassadors like Michael Oren who need protection. The former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Danny Ayalon at Oxford, 3 years ago, almost being crushed by a mob. The new Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, who I'll see next week, Daniel Taub, going to Edinburgh, needing 200 police to protect him. Is that true of any other country in the world? So
Well, but Shmuley, I think one important thing to remember in this context, and Professor Wiesel was alluding to this by speaking about the gypsies, is that unfortunately, there is an enormous amount of hatred and bias in the world. And in Europe, where there is unquestionably anti-Semitism, there is also a deep and abiding anti-Arab sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment. That exists. In the United States, the instances you cite are accurate instances. They all happened. But the American Jewish community on the whole doesn't feel itself in the United States to be in a tremendously vulnerable position. And politically, it's certainly not in a vulnerable position. Right? By contrast, many other groups feel themselves to be much more vulnerable and they feel that they have a much harder time affecting the shape of public discourse. So this is not to say that these aren't real problems. It's to say that some of it, not all, but some of it, is a product of the phenomenon of hatred of the other. And the other can be a lot of different people. It can be gypsies, it can be Jews. It's also possible for it to be Arabs, and in many European countries it is. And if you look at the rhetoric of anti-Arab, anti-immigrant sentiment in many European countries, that too sounds worrisomely familiar.
But in our community, thank God in the Jewish community, there's a robust tradition of freedom of speech and debate, and we're not going to shout down other people no matter what argument they're going to make. But I hear you. So Mendy, let me turn to, by the way, we're coming to the very end, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you why. Because I feel so guilty watching Samantha Power sitting in front of me, knowing that she's got a world to rescue. God almighty, Samantha, if you weren't a hero for being here the entire time. I think the American Jewish community also doesn't appreciate how vital Samantha is to the security of the state of Israel, because when the United States, which is Israel's greatest ally and friend in the entire world, exercises its veto at the UN Security Council with rapid condemnations, many condemnations, it is Samantha who literally exercises that veto. That's quite a responsibility. But you're very popular here. I want you to see that. But you knew that. Mendy, so here you walk around this university with the yarmulke, and you've got a big beard, and it kind of says, I may be part of a particular ethnic group. People may know who you are. Are students feeling intimidated on campus? You tried very hard to organize this event and to stand up to some of what Mahmoud Abbas would say about Israel. And again, I have no issue with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. I do have a problem with maligning character assassination of Israel. Are students intimidated? Why don't they come out in bigger number? Why don't we see greater support for Israel? Or do you think Jewish students keep a lower profile? Is anti-Semitism beginning to invade the American campus by silencing Jewish voices, and that they're not standing up for the Jewish state the way they might otherwise do?
Well, it's a particularly sensitive subject at NYU where, I believe at the end of last year in April, if I'm not mistaken, there was the SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a very successful group on campus. I'm actually a little jealous for just their reach. I do not admire their tactics or ever want to imitate them, but they have a really far reach. They're very creative. They very immoral. They went around with little leaflets notifying the students at NYU that they would be evicted from their rooms the following morning. And this was done at a dorm which was known to have the most Jews, so the Jews immediately said, oh, look, you're targeting the Jews, and they claimed, no, there's non-Jews there too. I was not at NYU at the time, I honestly don't know. But what it did show me was that of all the human rights abuses and all of the atrocities going on in the world, that Israel, it just shows the special attention that Israel gets on campus. I mean, like there was never signs slipped under the doors to make the case for the 800 Egyptians who had their homes destroyed in the exact same way, in perhaps a much harsher fashion. I believe they had 8 hours to leave their homes when El-Sisi destroyed 800 homes to build a giant lake to stop the tunnels from coming into Egypt. Most people wouldn't even know that happened, or it goes completely unnoticed, or even just Syria, which is like 45 kilometers from the Israeli border where people are being slaughtered every single day. Again, no recognition, no visibility on campus. There's no Syrian rights group. There is one North Korean human rights group, and I think that's the only one besides the 5 groups that constantly attack Israel. And for this reason is why I would slightly have a different take than that proposed by Noah Feldman, even though it's a little bit humbling to even be on a stage with him.
No one ever wins an argument with Professor Noah Feldman.
I know.
You're treading on very I've been debating
Yeah.
for 25 years. I've lost every time. But go ahead.
Yeah.
So
I'm banking on the fact that my father said it was the end of the debate. I'm hoping it'll end right after I speak, and he won't have a chance to respond. I'm kind of counting on that.
now that's the way to debate.
Yeah. So you could all leave as soon as I'm done. No, so, he brought up how, I don't want to misconstrue his words. He did not say that, he said that anti-Semitism will not disappear magically if Israel ended the occupation, as it's often called. I would have a different word for it, but that's besides the point. And I understand he's not saying that, but he did say that's involved. That he gives people, if it's not the cause of anti-Semitism, it's certainly an excuse for it. And I think that's one of the biggest, the most dangerous ideas going around is that all of this is justified. All of this hatred, the fact that in England, my friends at university there do feel afraid, and as I've heard my father will tell anyone, they feel afraid to wear a yarmulke on campus. Thank God here it's not like that yet, but it's getting pretty close. We have a guy on campus with a giant sign saying the Jews control the internet. I mean, no one takes that seriously, but it's getting worse. But the thing you always hear is the occupation, the occupation, the occupation. And we were just giving out signs at NYU. I have a friend here who helped me give out signs, and we found this girl who wanted to ask us about the debate. And she said, are you from Israel? I was like, no, I'm not from Israel, but I studied there. She's like, oh, I really don't like Israel. I was like, why? She's like, because of what's happening in Palestine. I said, are you talking about Gaza? She's like, Palestine. I was like, where? What are you talking about? Give me an example of what you're upset about. She said, I have a friend who's a reporter in Palestine. I don't know where. I mean, she didn't know about the West Bank and Gaza. She didn't know there was such a divide. She thought Gaza was Palestine. I mean, the level of ignorance was considerable. And that's what you see with most of the students. Israel just gets a bad, and it's just the occupation. That is the word. That's the word that everyone uses to explain themselves and why they have this irrational obsession with this one relatively minor human rights abuse. It's definitely not ideal. Every human deserves a vote, and I hope we can figure this out. But compared to what's happening all over the region, very close. And the example I always give is even in Mexico. Campuses have huge drug consumptions. There's a lot of drug consumption on campus. Between 2006 and 2010, in the first 4 years of the drug war, declared by Felipe Calderon, 34,000 people were killed in relation to the drug war. And that's something that students could really make a change. The entire markets in the United States, if there was a campaign to try and bring down violence in Mexico by saying no to drugs, the way Nancy Reagan said it 20 years ago, if they could do something like that, I mean, if you care about human life, there are so many other things, but they won't bring up anything. And that's the excuse that's always given, that it's the occupation. So true, maybe that's involved, and maybe if we found a resolution, which I do not believe the resolution is the creation of a Palestinian state, not in these conditions, not now, certainly. But I don't think we could ever use that as an excuse for anything. I mean, even the PLO, I'll end now, the PLO was not founded in 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It was founded in 1964 when such a conclusion would have been implausible. Israel was in no position to take back the land. They had no plans to. And that's when the PLO was founded, to get Israel out of Israel, not out of the West Bank and not out of Gaza, to get Israel out of Israel. So I'd be careful before I ever even involve that in any way.
If you get more applause than your father, then I have to end the evening, because that's just not right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to draw this to a close. We will end within 3 minutes. We started a little bit late, I'm sorry, because of the weather. Professor Feldman, even Ambassador Power, who came straight from the UN. I want to just give a very short message, and I'm going to ask Noach to conclude, and I'm going to thank Professor Wiesel. Our organization, This World of Values Network, believes in spreading the light, the universal light, global light of the Jewish people to all peoples, all nations. I started this at Oxford when Noach was a Rhodes Scholar. I really believe in the infinite dignity and quality of all mankind. I believe that Muslims are my brothers and my sisters. I really believe that there should be peace. I think it will come through the universal morality employed by all peoples. If any Jew ever intentionally harms a Muslim, the way, for example, a Palestinian teenager was murdered by Jewish terrorists, because if you kill civilians specifically, you're a terrorist on any side, then it must be condemned by rabbis. I condemn Baruch Goldstein as an abomination to Judaism when he slaughtered 30 innocent people at prayer. But I must hear from Mahmoud Abbas that he must do the same, that if 3 Israeli teenagers are murdered, that you must condemn it as an abomination to Islam. Islam is a great and enlightened world religion, and I'm often attacked for saying this. It bothers me that the Jewish community should have a short memory. We were taken in by the Muslims in 1492 when we were expelled from Catholic Spain, Catholic Portugal in 1498, when Manuel III wanted to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, but he had to expel his Jews as a wedding gift. We dare not forget these things, but there must be universal morality. Israel deserves to live. Israel deserves to be at peace. And my Muslim brothers and sisters, I hope, will accept that, just as I will always insist that every Muslim citizen of Israel be treated with the same rights as an Israeli, because Israel is a vibrant, beautiful, warm, and just democracy. And I would always be attached to Israel as a Jew, but I love it because of the values and the freedoms that it upholds. Let me just say, as we wrap up, and then I'm going to give Noach the last word. Samantha, I cannot thank you enough for being here this evening. I know how busy you are. It's not easy pegging you down for anything. You need to understand how much I believe in you and how much I've always believed in you. You are such an incredible voice of human rights. I love America because of what America stands for. I love America because of the way it liberated the camps, and I love America because it did in Kosovo largely through brave journalists like you, the way it stopped genocides. And to see you now in a position of power, Mandy, you spoke about the Syrians. Samantha was the first any major American government official to speak out about the slaughter in Syria. You have consistently put your credibility, authority, and name on the line to stand up for complete strangers, all of whom are God's children. You represent the finest of American ideals of liberty, justice, and democracy, and we're all so grateful to you, and I hope that you will go further and further, and thank you so much for being here. I've said enough about Professor Wiesel, and we're all going to, in a moment, we're going to vote of thanks from David Sterling, but Noach, you get the very final word. I have loved Noach Feldman for a quarter of a century. He's been one of my closest, dearest friends. We were so proud of him when he was at Oxford. He got like a PhD in about a month, became fluent in Arabic like in 6 months. He's a colleague of Samantha's from Harvard. You know, the Jewish community loves scholarship. I've always been so proud of your achievements, and your parents should be so immensely proud of everything that you've done. And now to see you as one of the greatest legal experts in the world fills my heart with pride and joy. And you get the final word, and then we're going to hear from David, please.
Boteach's father and son are a hard act to follow. And it really should be Professor Wiesel who should say the last word. But
then that decides it.
I just want to say, Professor Wiesel, that your legacy as a thinker, as a writer, as an intellectual, and as a model has had a tremendous impact on me and on many, many thousands of people like me, particularly because of the deeply felt way in which you've always connected Jewish particularity and tradition and identity with universal ideals, values, and humanity. And I think I heard that in all of our comments tonight in an aspirational form. You are a model whom we emulate and seek to emulate, and I want to thank you very much for that.
Rabbi Eliezer, everybody wants to hear from you, please.
It's becoming a tradition already. Every week we come to see you here, and every week we hear questions, eternal questions that have no answers about Jewish destiny, Jewish policy, and the world as such. Where are we going? Where is the world heading? Is the world better now than when I was born a long time ago? Can the world improve? What has to be done to improve the world? So less poverty, less humiliation, the worst of all, the worst sin that any humanity, any social group can commit is humiliation, to humiliate another group. Nothing is worse than that. To shame, to bring shame. In doing so, one brings shame on oneself, naturally. And shame and shame and shame. It has no end. Look, what we are doing here is what? We are trying to use our own life experiences see in them a motivation for our moral obligations today. Why are we doing what we are doing? In clearer, what are we doing here tonight? We could stay home, read books, watch a good television program on history or something, whatever. What are we doing here? We are here because we still believe in the power of words, that words can bring life just as they can remove life. With all the words. It's an ancient mystical tradition that God has given men, all men, the power of words. That's all, words. But with these words, we can build castles or tombstones. With whatever we do, we can bring hope or despair. It's always in our hands. Ultimately, don't accuse God. Don't accuse society. Don't accuse an ideology. Us. What have we done to prevent evil from growing? When you go into the street, even in New York, often, when we go into the street, there are beggars I have never seen lately, last few years, beggars. When I see a person with his hand open, how can you not stop and put that? At the same time, you feel humiliated. The open hand. Who are you to put something in his hand? But if you don't, it's worse. It's not easy these days. Not easy because generations come and go. King Solomon was the wisest of all kings. And the wisest of all men, actually, Chacham down from all men. He knew what he was talking about. But he says, look, can we learn, really? Can we really learn from each other? If not, what are we doing here? If we can, why don't we? And I believe we can. If I have chosen, it was my choice, to be a writer and a teacher. That's my goal in life, to be a teacher and a writer. Naturally, father, of course, but a writer and a teacher. Why? I use words, and those words have been used by generations and generations and generations of scholars and their students and their disciples and their disciples. And in each generation, something new emerges in these ancient texts that you simply repeat and you reverse and you remember. And because you remember them, they come alive. And because they are alive, they bring life. Therefore, I love books on history. I like historians. Why they write? Why does a historian feel the need to take one incident and prevent it from being forgotten? Among hundreds of incidents, why that one? Why? Nobody knows. But the fact is, it's here. And the sum of all that is what we call civilization, culture. And of course, we believe what we do with our lives is what matters. If I say to myself, I live, and therefore all I have is what I have, it's mine, and that's it. I owe nothing, nobody. I've paid enough. It would be wrong, and silly, and childish, and gratuitous. Nothing. It would mean nothing. And I rather believe that everything has a meaning. Now, we come to extremes.
Rabbi Eliezer, but that's why what Samantha said before, that you could take 10 million readers and choose that one moment of history and choose the martyrdom of 6 million faceless, innocent victims and give them eternity is something that we all so salute. It's actually hard to believe that we could all sit on the same stage and you could sit in the same room as the face of the 6 million martyred Jews, because the Holocaust was tragically one of the most defining moments in Jewish history. It's kind of sad to say that a moment of hate should be the defining moment, but who could overcome something that cataclysmic? And that's why, Rabbi Eliezer, we're so in awe of everything you represent and everything you are to us, and that you could come tonight in this storm and be with us is such a phenomenal honor. And ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say as we conclude, because I promised everyone that we would end by a certain time, and I've got Secret Service guys who are heavily armed looking right at me. Samantha, please tell them I come in peace. The battle for Israel is raging on campus. Whether you are the right wing, left wing, Jews deserve a country. It's a little tiny sliver. Please be involved. Israel deserves to defend its good name. It deserves to simply defend itself. If you want to be critical of it, so be it. That's the beauty of Israel as a democracy. But my son is running a new organization on campus that will be more vocal. Because NYU, a lot of things are happening on this campus, and they should at least be responded to. When we took Dr. Mehmet Oz to Israel, and he's the most famous doctor in the world, biggest daytime TV personality in America, and he's Muslim, and he took me to meet young Palestinian students in East Jerusalem, I was very proud of the fact that they stood up for what they believed in, Palestinian aspirations. And even though I debated with them, I said, you're doing the right thing. It's what you represent. Shouldn't the Jewish students and those who love Israel do the same, and having a voice and being active and giving Israel a voice where it's being maligned? I hope you'll all join. And ladies and gentlemen, I now want to ask David Sterling to please close the evening. And Samantha, if you have one split second, I would love for us to take a picture with the panel, if you can, just before you leave, and then we're going to go. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. David Sterling.
Thank you, Shmuley. David Sterling. I am on the board of This World, the Values Network. I represent the board here tonight, and thanking you all for coming. I'd like to thank Professors Wiesel and Feldman, Rabbi Shmuley, and student Mendy. Thank you very much. See you next lecture.